Hello, everyone, and welcome to your Module 16 lecture. This is about freshwater resources. So it's about water that, people use. So let's get right into it. Here's our table of contents here. We're going to go into like how much fresh water are we really talking about here. Then we'll start to look into ways that we can access and manage it. We'll look at aquifers, dams, pros and cons of those, water transfer, which is moving water from one place to another, desalination, which is removing the salt from ocean water, methods for water conservation, and then the potential for water conflicts. So first, our global freshwater resources. Well, there is a lot of water on Earth. 71% of Earth is covered by water, but we still have water scarcity and water stress. And that's because almost all that water is not useful to humans. Why not? What's wrong with most of that water? Well, there we go. That's the first one. Over 97% of it is salty. That's not useful for us. You can't drink it. We can't use it to irrigate it. We can't use it in industry. Salty water is not useful to us. Less than 3% of Earth's water is fresh. Now, that 3% is quite a bit of water, but there's actually a pretty big problem with most of that fresh water, and that is that about 80% of it is frozen. Can't use it. It's ice. So now we're cutting it way, way down even more. So here's our fresh water, but look, the vast majority of it, ice caps and glaciers, not accessible to us. Most of the rest of it is in groundwater. That's the biggest source. And we can use a lot of that groundwater, but there are some groundwater sources that are found so deep that they can't reasonably easily be tapped. And some of that water is actually inaccessible to us. Very small amount of the rest of it is the water that we find in lakes and in rivers. And those are going to be some of our most important freshwater resources. Less than 1% of the water on Earth is not not salty, not frozen, and accessible. It is a very, very small proportion of the total water on Earth that we can actually get and use. Now, that less than 1% is still like a lot of water, and it's actually plenty of water to go around, even for such a large population as ours. The additional problem that we see is that water is not evenly distributed. Some places are very water rich. We happen to live in a very water rich part of the world. So we very seldom would have any like water restrictions for watering our lawns. I do recall it a few times, but it's rare. Where like California over here, they are much more stressed. So it's unevenly distributed around the world. And we can see regions where there's going to be particular water stress when you compare this map. So the orange and the red are going to be areas of water stress with areas that we know have high and growing populations. Remember, our sub-Saharan Africa, we have like Niger and Nigeria and Chad and Central African Republic and Burkina Faso and Mali, and all of these countries are going to more than double their populations in the next 30 years. And these are areas of water stress. So that is definitely going to be an issue. We also see the Middle East over into India. These are large population centers where we see a lot of water stress. So depending on where you are in the world, you might have water problems and you might not have water problems because of its unequal distribution. Now, what are we using the water for? Well, the vast majority of it goes to agriculture. Relatively small amounts, the water you demand for your shower and for your drinking and for your dishwasher, that domestic use represents a relatively small proportion of water. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't take water conservation measures. Just means that agriculture is the biggest consumer of water, and it's not particularly close. Industry also uses a lot of water in manufacturing, cool down machines, power production, things like that. Use quite a bit of water. But the difference between our domestic use and our agricultural use is quite large. All right. So what are our freshwater resources? So the first one we're going to look at are aquifers. And this is sort of accessible large amounts of groundwater. Now, in my head, I always sort of imagine them as underground lakes. It's not exactly that. It's porous rock layers. So maybe like some gravelly rock and the water will infiltrate in there and fill in the rock underneath. But some of these porous rock layers are really very, very big. And so there can be a lot of water in these aquifers. And they are an extremely important resource for so many people. Look at our stats here. Over 2 billion people rely on aquifers for their drinking water. Nearly half, about 45% of global agriculture is supported by aquifers. Aquifers can either be renewable or non-renewable. It depends on whether or not they recharge. Recharge is our aquifer word for refill, to replenish. And they'll recharge through typically rainfall or maybe streaks or streams, rivers, creeks, things like that, and water infiltrating down through the ground and trickling down into the aquifer. Even in these rechargeable aquifers, just because they are renewable does not necessarily mean we're using them renewably. It means they're theoretically renewable, but if we're withdrawing water faster than they recharge, then they're not renewable. Then we're using them unsustainably. And then there are some aquifers that basically don't recharge. They might be very deep underground. They may be surrounded by impermeable layers, so water cannot infiltrate into them. And they're these kind of one-time reservoirs that we can access, but once they're done, they're done. And this will depend on the location and depth and things like that, which we're looking at here. The two main types of aquifers are going to be unconfined aquifers and confined aquifers. Unconfined aquifers are going to be sort of shallow, and you can see them right here. And they're often going to be fed by, percolating, infiltrating rainwater. And they also might be connected with bodies of water so that some of the water will sort of bleed into these aquifers. This allows the water to flow. As water maybe trickles in here, the water will generally be flowing towards the body of water, either the lake or the stream or something like that. And so water can enter and water can exit the aquifer. So there is some movement of the water, and that's an unconfined aquifer. It has an entrance and an exit. A confined aquifer has an entrance, but not an exit. So see how this layer is shown on the bottom is bedrock. The water can't come through there. And under here is clay. And if clay is compacted enough, as you know, clay, as we remember from the soil, clay does not allow water to infiltrate. And so the water won't come through here. Now there might be an entrance up at the top where water can enter in, but because water can't exit, this is going, there's our unconfined aquifer. As water enters the unconfined aquifer, it's going to pressurize the water because water is trying to get in, but it can't exit. So the water becomes pressurized. These are also called artesian aquifers, I believe is how you pronounce that. And what they're characterized by is when you tap them, see right here, we have this artesian well, we drilled down to get access. Because that confined aquifer is under pressure, the water will just boom, spring right up, come right up to the surface. We don't even need to pump it. Because it's pressurized, it will just rise right up to the surface. And that's a confined aquifer that we see down there. It's sort of being trapped between bedrock and clay. The water's under pressure. And so when you spring a well, it will come right up to the surface. Now, what this diagram is not showing are completely confined aquifers. And so you see here how water is able to enter maybe through this lake up here and percolate down in. A non-renewable aquifer, a completely confined aquifer, would be completely surrounded by clay or bedrock, unable to take in more water. And those are non-renewable resources. Those tend to be quite a bit deeper and tend to be very old aquifers, have existed for tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of years, maybe even more, maybe even millions of years. As you may not be surprised to hear, we often use aquifers unsustainably. And this can cause a host of problems. Unsustainable aquifer use is when you pump faster than they are replenished. Now, the first thing we want to look at here is what's called saltwater intrusion. And this happens with coastal aquifers. So this is specifically an issue when an aquifer is near the coast, and so there is seawater nearby. And if you look right here, we see our well. So we tap down right in here to tap into that fresh water. Well, if we overdraw it, that's going to slowly begin to draw the salt water in over to the fresh water until the salt water ultimately contaminates the fresh water. And once that happens, now it's not a freshwater resource anymore. That water has become kind of brackish, basically. Can't use it for irrigation, it'll kill the plants. Can't use it for drinking, it'll dehydrate you. You can't use it anymore. So overpumping near the coast can lead to saltwater intrusion. That's negative outcome number one. Negative outcome number two is what is called subsidence. Now, we looked at subsidence in Unit 3 when we were talking about subsurface mining, when the land caves in. Subsidence in this context is a little bit different. This is when the land starts to sink down. As you draw out the water from the porous layers of rock, that water may have been supporting the rock and land above it. And as those cavities empty out, the rock will start to crunch down. The weight of the earth will start to push down because there's no longer water supporting it. And this is the sinking of the land. This is a wild picture, always sort of like boggles the mind to look at this thing. This is in the San Joaquin Valley in California. In the San Joaquin, there's a lot of agriculture there, and there was an aquifer, San Joaquin Aquifer. Now, this is also a pretty dry part of California, so the agriculture relied very heavily on this aquifer, and they pumped it quickly. They overpumped it, and they started to notice the land subsiding. And this might have been foundations shifting and maybe like a barn starting to lean because the foundation on which it was built was starting to crumble a little bit. And this is evidently, in 1925, this is where the land was. This is where the ground was. That's where the cars drove, or the horses rode. This is where the soil was and the plants grew. And in 50 years, the land subsided 9 meters all the way down to there, which is crazy to sort of think about. How far the land sunk down is wild. This is a useful sort of visual of it. So I'm just going to play this and kind of narrate it here. But your note here is that subsidence can also lead to flooding. But I think that this little cartoon is a nice visual. So here we have this city, and this guy is coming on in here and there. Here's our aquifer underneath. Notice how it's like porous water there. And so he's gonna put his tap in and start sucking up the water. There we go. We needed to take our baths. We needed to, drink, and we need it for our agriculture. So they suck up the water. Now you can see that water was holding up all this rock. But now that the water is not there, the weight of the land above it will start to cause the land to crunch, to fall down a little bit. And there it goes. And here you see subsidence and how this will mess with buildings because the foundation of the buildings will go down. So that showed our subsidence, but now we get a double problem because now it's going to rain. And that rainwater is going to try to infiltrate into the ground to refill the aquifer. But look at the aquifer. It doesn't exist anymore. There is no longer porous rock underneath. So that water has nowhere to infiltrate. And this, because the water cannot infiltrate under the ground because the aquifer is gone, will lead to flooding. So I think that's a nice little cartoon somebody made at some point. Now, unsustainable aquifer use can also lead to sort of like very rapid subsidence, which you know better as a sinkhole. This happens under very specific conditions. There has to be certain type of material, maybe limestone or a certain type of clay. And honestly, I'm showing this video. I don't actually know if this sinkhole has formed due to overpumping, but it's a video of a sinkhole opening up in real time, and it's just terrifying. It's wild. Look at this. Look at this thing. See it happening. Oh, man. Look at these trees. These are like 60-foot trees. They're gone. The trees are gone. They're gone. The earth just ate those giant trees. There's no trace of them. They have vanished. Sinkholes genuinely terrify me. It's like a weird, just like a weird phobia I have, this natural disaster thing. Sinkholes freak me out. I don't like them. I don't approve of them, and I want to avoid them because they're just earth eaters. So that can also happen, and that actually happens quite a bit in Florida. They use a lot of groundwater. They have very shallow aquifers, and Florida has a sinkhole issue as those cavities, those underground cavities, are no longer filled with water. A lot of sinkholes have opened up. All righty, so moving on from aquifers, now we're going to get into dams. Now we use dams to help manage flowing surface water, to help manage rivers. This water in a river, as you can see right here, it's flowing downhill. And it's flowing downhill fast, and it will empty out into the ocean eventually. And once it empties out into the ocean, it is salty water, and we can't use it anymore. It's no good to us anymore. Dams help slow down the flow of river and give us greater access to this fresh water. They help us manage this fresh water so that we can use it more. We can use more of it. That's the purpose of dams. Few case studies that will know what you're looking at. This picture right here is the Hoover Dam. And the largest dam in the world is in China. It is the Three Gorges Dam that has dammed the Yangtze River, which is like the third largest river in the world. So dams, there are a lot of pros to dams. The goods of dams: it reduces freshwater runoff, increasing access to fresh water. Gives us greater access to fresh water because it slows it down. It keeps it fresh for longer before it flows into the sea. It can also generate quite a bit of electricity. In this diagram here, I know it's a little blurry, but you can generate hydroelectric power. You basically allow some of the water to flow through the dam, and that spins a turbine, and you can create electricity that way. It also prevents flooding downstream. I mentioned the Three Gorges Dam. In the 90s in China, the Yangtze River flooded, and there were millions upon millions of people in, oh boy, my China geography isn't good right now. It's either Shanghai or Beijing. I can't quite remember. I think it's Shanghai, but I'm not sure, that were displaced because that river overflowed so much that people who lived along the banks of it, their houses were flooded, destroyed. A lot of people displaced. A lot of people died. Huge economic, social sort of catastrophe for them. The Three Gorges Dam will prevent that, because if the river starts to swell, that water can be trapped and released in a more controlled way. So it prevents downstream flooding. It also creates reservoirs. Look behind here, creates these reservoirs, and those can be stocked with fish. They're good for boating, they're good for fishing. Like Lake Mead over near the Grand Canyon. That's not a natural lake. That was caused by I'm pretty sure the Hoover Dam. There are two dams along there, but I'm pretty sure it's the Hoover Dam. And that's like a really, it's a nice tourist spot now for recreation. So there's that pro of it also. However, dams have cons as well. While it prevents flooding downstream, it causes flooding upstream because you have to create this massive reservoir. So that will displace a lot of people. Again, I keep referring to that Three Gorges Dam in China. That displaced, I believe the estimate I read was about 2 million people. There were villages, even small cities, that were pushed underwater because of the massive reservoir that this created. So 2 million people got displaced because of it. It does lose a lot of water to evaporation because it creates these lakes, and that water will then heat up and will evaporate. They're very expensive to build up front. They do often have decent payout because they create, once they're built, they create pretty cheap electricity, but the cost up front to build them is very, very high. They also block that nutrient-rich sediment downstream. They don't let it flow to the estuaries. Remember how that sediment is so important to the primary productivity of estuaries. Estuaries can become far less productive when we build those dams because that nutrient-rich sediment is blocked. The sediment behind dams decomposes. The organic matter back there decomposes. And as it decomposes in an anoxic environment where there's not much oxygen, it creates methane. And methane is a greenhouse gas about 20 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. So while they produce this renewable energy, so we can get electricity by not burning fossil fuels, and that is stupendous, there is not zero greenhouse gas emissions. And it's because of this decomposition that happens behind the dams that creates methane. This will also prevent, the dams block fish from reaching spawning grounds. There are some ways to mitigate this, but if you think of like salmon in particular, they spawn way upstream. Well, if the salmon run into a dam, they can't get to their upstream spawning grounds. And you can see these upstream migratory fish, you can see their populations crater because of dams. And then if you dam too much, rivers may not actually reach the ocean, leading to a total destruction of the estuary or fishery. And the Colorado River is a great example of that. So like we have like blocking nutrient-rich sediment. That's kind of like the light version of it, assuming some water still gets here. Here's the really bad version, is that water doesn't even reach the estuary. Water doesn't even reach the ocean. And that does happen. The Colorado River, as I just mentioned, look at the flow of the Colorado River that reaches the mouth, that reaches, it's called the Gulf of California. It's kind of like the armpit of Mexico. On the West Coast, it's called Baja California. There's this little arm of Mexico that goes down along the Pacific Ocean. Underneath that little arm is where the Colorado River should empty. But the Colorado River does not actually reach the sea almost all the time now. And you can see the flow drop for the Hoover Dam. Then the Glen Canyon Dam was completed some 30 years later. And there's like 6 more dams. There's one right on the border of Mexico called the Morales Dam. And that one, almost all the time, blocks that water from reaching the sea. And this is actually what the Colorado River Delta looks like in Mexico now. The river does not reach the sea. I can't stress to you how crazy that is. The Colorado River is enormous. It carries so much water from snowmelt from the Rockies, just pouring down from Colorado down through the desert. And this thing does not reach the sea anymore. It dies basically at the border of between US and Mexico. We've dammed it all up and we use that water for our agriculture, for our cities, and we let very little of it, if any at all, trickle into Mexico, which of course Mexico is none too pleased about. Now, the other thing we're going to get into, and this is with the help of dams, is water transfers. Once we build dams, we can manipulate water. We've built these, once we have these reservoirs we've created, we can kind of make water flow where we want it to. And a great case study for this is in California. This is the relatively water wealthy north of California. Now, most of California has been in a pretty bad drought for quite a while now, but historically and typically there's more water up here, and that's because these are the Sierra Nevada mountains, and the snowmelt from the Sierra Nevada mountains creates the Sacramento River and some other rivers, I'm not sure what they're called, and these rivers flow into San Francisco Bay. And historically, San Francisco Bay, very important estuary, very nutrient rich, great primary productivity. If you've ever been to San Francisco, you may have been to what's called Fisherman's Wharf, and you may have noticed there's like no fishermen there anymore. It's basically like a tourist trap. There's, I don't know, you can go to get like chocolate and ride a Ferris wheel or something like that. But historically, this was a really productive fishery over here. What California did was they wanted to send water from the water-rich north to the water-poor south. And that's because the soil in this central valley right here, very fertile soil, we found out in like the 19th century, all these people who went out for like the gold rush and came out to California, and then they're like, you know, most of them didn't find gold, but it wasn't that easy to get out there. But what they did find, as all these people moved out west, there was very fertile soil. And there is an aquifer down here. That's San Joaquin Aquifer. There's also a Central Valley Aquifer. And so agriculture in California was sort of born here. Now, in the 20th century, as those aquifers started to dry up, and especially during the Dust Bowl, this became one of the most important agricultural regions in the world because the Midwest had just died. But the aquifers were starting to dry up. Excuse me. So they're thinking like, well, that's trouble. The Midwest isn't growing anything. We need California to be able to grow stuff, and now the aquifers are drying up. So they started to build these projects to transfer water from the north to the south through a series of aqueducts, pumping stations, canals. And so this is a very arid part of the country, but they get the North's water, and that water gets diverted to Los Angeles for domestic and industrial use, but most of it is going to agriculture right around here. So as I sort of mentioned, Northern California has the water, but we engineered the water to flow to the south and away from San Francisco Bay down here to the south. Now, that has some consequences. Sorry for jumping around there. This water transfer is successful in that it has helped and continues to help sustain California agriculture. There's some amazing stuff about California water. California water is one of the most valuable resources in the country. It's really sort of like weird how it's managed, and there's some really good documentaries I could point you to. California water is fascinating. Anyway, the big downside of it was that the San Francisco Bay got really negatively impacted. Fisherman's Wharf doesn't have fishermen any there because the fishery is essentially dead because the Sacramento River no longer flows to it. So the primary productivity of this estuary bottomed out, and it doesn't support much fishing anymore. And so that's a big downside. But the upside is, of course, you get water to places that didn't used to have water. Here are cons. It's going to reduce water resources for the region water is diverted from, of course. Estuaries lose productivity, just mentioned that with the San Francisco Bay, and it can negatively impact those fisheries again. And then it's not always very efficient. There's a lot of these aqueducts will leak a lot. They're made of concrete, so they'll heat up and they'll evaporate more. So there's a fair amount of water losses from leaks and evaporation. So it's not like this very efficient transfer, but it still can do it. Now, this one case study, definitely got to know, is the Aral Sea. Now look at what we have here. The Aral Sea used to be the third largest inland sea in the world. It's former Soviet Union. And then after Soviet Union fell, it's like border of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And here's a satellite picture of it in its glory in 1977. This is when it started to decline, because in the 60s, the Soviet Union diverted some rivers. I believe they're up here in the north. They diverted the rivers to cotton fields because they wanted to grow some cotton to make some clothes. These were the rivers that fed this sea. And look at what starts to happen to it. This is 10 years later. You can see it start to dry up. 13 years after that, real shallow. Look at 2006, 2009, 2013. This sea is basically gone. The third largest inland sea in the world. This is an enormous body of water. It was ringed by little cities, former Soviet Union, really productive fisheries, a lot of cities that were there with productive economies. Those cities are now ghost towns because in place of this sea, there is now just a vast desert. There are actually fishing boats that are just marooned in the middle of the desert because the sea retreated faster than they could keep up with it. And so you just like go out there and you're in the middle of a desert and there's this boat. You look around you at all sides and it's just horizon of desert. And there are this rusted out old boat sitting in the middle of the desert. This is one of the most spectacular ecological catastrophes humans have ever caused, is the disappearance of the Aral Sea. It is gone. 90% of its value, the entire fishery loss, cities completely abandoned, just ghost towns. So that's a very good case study to know of the dangers of water transfer. All right, so we've looked at our, I don't know, I guess we call them like our natural freshwater resources, which is groundwater and then surface water. And with surface water, we can dam and we can transfer and stuff like that. Now, the other thing we can look at is desalination, which has enormous potential because remember, over 90%, 97% of Earth's water is salty. There is a ridiculous amount of water on Earth. So if we could just make the salty water not salty, we could solve like every single water problem on Earth, right? Well, theoretically, yes. This process is called desalination. There are two different processes. One's called distillation, which is just boiling the water, because when you boil salt water, the gas that it forms, the water vapor it forms, is not salty. The salt is left behind. So you just trap the water vapor, recondense it, cool it back down, and then you have fresh water. That is less commonly used. My understanding, the more common form of desalination is called reverse osmosis, which is putting water under pressure through a semi-permeable membrane to get out the salt. Either way, you are creating fresh water from salty water, which of course has the potential to solve all sorts of water stress problems. Here is, what are the pros? There's a lot of salt water. We could get way more water in the world if we just desalinated. So that's the pro. Can it improve our access to it? Look at where our plants are. There's a huge congregation of them in the Middle East here. Remember, these are extremely dry places. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Israel, United Arab Emirates, places like that. These are really dry, so they rely heavily on desalination. Japan's got a bunch of them. The US, over in California, we got a bunch of plants. Florida's got a bunch of plants. Coast here in Chile has a bunch of plants. So you can sort of see where these congregations are. They are generally going to be in drier areas, though that's not uniformly true. What's the problem with it? First problem, it is crazy expensive. The desalinated water costs much, much, much more than ground and surface water resources. On average, about 5 times more, can be upwards of like 20 times more, depending on, you know, how cheap the groundwater is. So if we compare those prices, look here, groundwater is always going to be, this is the price ranging producing water per acre foot is just like a unit of measurement. Always going to be less than $1,000, but desalinated water can be over $4,000 and never cheaper than $2,000. So it's much, much more expensive. Here's our surface water range also. See that groundwater is the cheapest. Those shallow aquifers are often the easiest to exploit. And so this cost difference is really, really important because we use a lot of water. So when water is expensive, that can create a significant strain on an economy. That's con number one. It's very expensive. Con number two, uses a ton of energy. If you are boiling it, well, obviously it takes water to boil that energy. If you're doing reverse osmosis, you have to have that water under pressure, and that takes energy to put that water under pressure. So it takes a lot of very energy intensive to create this water. And that's part of the cost. That's why it's expensive, is because it uses so much energy. And of course, if you're not using a renewable energy source, then that energy intensiveness will release greenhouse gases as well. And so you'll be causing that environmental problem. The other big problem is we separate the water from the salt. Well, what do we do with the salt? What do we do with these mountains of salt brine that are left over? You can dump them back into the ocean, I guess. But if I were to dump this mountain of salt in the ocean, it would make that area of the ocean really, really salty, and it would kill everything. It would make things much more salty than normal ocean water, and everything would die. This is way more salt than we can just like eat. You know, our like culinary salt demands are much, much, much less than what we produce from desalination. So you have to figure out what to do with it. Usually what's done is it is put back into water, but you try to like get it off the coast out into the open ocean where there's less living things, where that salt can diffuse more. But it's a challenge. And if we do this on a much larger scale, we're just going to be making more and more and more salt that creates a greater and greater and greater ecological challenge for us to deal with. So those are our cons of desalination and why we don't do it more. It's expensive. It uses a lot of energy, and the salt waste is a pain in the neck to deal with. All right. So we just got through our kind of like how we manage our fresh water, how we have those resources and stuff. So now just one slide on water conservation. If you remember, agriculture uses 70% of our water. So water conservation in agriculture is the place where we have the most potential for water savings. Because if we use less water, obviously less places will be under water stress. So there are two irrigation types. Actually, I guess we'll call it three irrigation types, or techniques that are more efficient. One's called drip irrigation. Some of you might have this in your gardens at home. These are like hoses that bleed water. And so they just kind of slowly seep water right onto the ground. And it's very slow, and there's less losses to evaporation, and it gives the roots of the target crop time to absorb them. Other irrigation methods, there's way more like runoff, and so a lot of the water you're irrigating with doesn't actually reach the target crop and ends up running off into a stream and then out into the ocean. That's wasted water. So drip irrigation for irrigation techniques is the most efficient. This picture here is showing center pivot irrigation. And this is, I don't know if you've ever like been on a plane and flown cross country, and when you're out over the west, looked out the window and ever notice that some of the farms are round. They're like, you'll see like these perfectly round patches of green. Those farms are using center pivot irrigation. At the center of it will usually be often a tap into an aquifer, direct into an aquifer, or like some irrigation pipe. And then from that center, you have these sprinklers that set out from the center and these tires. And those tires can drive the sprinkler system around in a circle with the center remaining sort of in a fixed position. So this arm, this long sprinkler is like the radius of a circle, and these wheels go around in a circle, and these sprinklers add water there. And that's a pretty water efficient way too, but it is not as good as drip irrigation. But it is still like an acceptable answer for how can we conserve water. Center pivot irrigation is a fine answer. Irrigating at night, very simple, very effective, less evaporation. When the sun's down, you'll lose less water to evaporation. And then plant drought resistant crops, plant crops that don't need so much water. We're not so great at that in this country. Like corn, the biggest crop we grow, is a very thirsty crop. Wheat is a very thirsty crop. Soy is a very thirsty crop. They use a lot of water. But if you grow stuff that needs less water, obviously you're going to need less. Domestic use, remember, it's a smaller percentage of our use, but that doesn't mean it's insignificant. That doesn't mean domestic water conservation efforts don't matter. They do. Water efficient appliances, your dishwasher, your washing machine, they use way less water than they used to. If you have a dishwasher that's like, you know, younger than 10 years old, it's going to be way more water efficient than a dishwasher that was made in the 80s or 90s. Low flow toilets. Toilets in our homes are one of the biggest water users there are. Old toilets used to use about 5 gallons per flush, and now we're down to about less than 2 gallons per flush. It's a big difference. Toilet water usage is greater in general than the water you use in a shower. So low flow toilets for domestic use are important. Gray water systems are interesting systems that recycle water within a house. Now, a good example is, let's say, the water that you shower with. You can't drink that water anymore, so we wouldn't want to recirculate that into, you know, your kitchen sink that you might drink from. But there's no reason that we couldn't flush a toilet with the water that you showered or did the dishes with. So gray water systems will recirculate used water back into toilets or non-potable places, places where you wouldn't use potable water, because your toilet is actually filling up with potable water, with drinkable water. There's no difference between the water that fills up your toilet than the water that comes out of your faucet, aside from the fact that like your toilet is probably not that clean. But all of that water is potable. But we don't need our toilet water to be drinkable. So if you recycle it and use the water that like you wash the dishes with and have that cycle to your toilet, that would save water. That's called a gray water system. They're pretty expensive to install, but they do save a lot. And then, you know, you got the simple things. If you get a question like, how could you reduce water use domestically? Don't be afraid to take the low-hanging fruit and say, take shorter showers. That's a perfectly acceptable answer. Now remember, industry was 22%. How can we save water in industry? I don't really know. I haven't bothered to like look that up. So I don't know, become an environmental engineer and answer that question, because industry uses a lot of water. So maybe you can answer that question for me and make a good deal of money as an environmental engineer in the meantime. That's a good job. Finally, water conflicts. And we'll be looking at some case studies for this in class. The two combinations that tend to make for water conflicts are high populations and low water availability. That's going to create water stress. When you got a lot of people and not much water, that's going to create stress. And there are lots of areas of water stress in the world. Water is also complicated because some of the most important water resources are rivers. And rivers don't know boundaries of countries. They will flow from one country to another. One example, and I think I have a little more on the next slide on it, but I'll just use this one for example. The Nile River flows from down here in Kenya and ends up in Egypt. Now there's a tributary of it called the Blue Nile, and that starts in Ethiopia. And that actually accounts for, by the time it gets to the main Nile, about 60% of the Nile's water. But it runs through Ethiopia. Ethiopia has just finished, this says in 2011 they started building it, this actually just finished a dam right on the border of Ethiopia and Sudan to control the waters of the Blue Nile. This is great for Ethiopia. They get some hydroelectricity, lowers their energy bills, more access to electricity. They get more access to fresh water. Guess who's super pissed about it? Sudan, and especially Egypt, because their part of the Nile now has way less flow, and they got some massive city centers that rely on the Nile, including Cairo down here. The Nile Delta over here is really important agriculturally, and that estuary could dry up. So that's an example of like one country acting in their interest in a way that could hurt another country. Here's some examples of Turkey and Syria, Turkey damming the Tigris and the Euphrates. The Tigris and the Euphrates, you guys, have been fought over for literally 5,000-6,000 years. This is some of our oldest civilizations. The Eden, the Garden of Eden, is referred to as being between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. These are dry areas, and these are these really valuable rivers that flow through them. And Turkey wants to access them, and Syria and Iraq are pissed about it. So here are a few like quotes. Turkish Prime Minister: water that flows to Turkey is from the Euphrates and Tigris. We're not saying to Syria and Iraq that we share their oil resources. They have no right to say that they share our water resources. So they're just like, back off. These are our rivers. We're going to do what we want with them. And they, of course, are not happy about that. When the sounds of guns and war drums fade in Syria and Iraq, new tensions may arise because of water, especially in their conflict with Turkey, from which the Euphrates and Tigris flow. Another example, and this is what I was just talking about, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. This used to be the Secretary General of the UN, Boutros Boutros-Ghali. The next war in our region will be over the waters of the Nile, not politics. Anwar el-Sadat said that water was the only matter that could take Egypt to war again. Many of our wars this century were about oil, but those of the next century will be about water. Water is the most valuable thing in the world. You cannot live without it, full stop. And when it gets threatened, people are going to fight over it. Here's one last example. The Mekong River starts in China, flows down through Laos, Cambodia, Thailand into Vietnam. The Mekong Delta of Vietnam is their most important agricultural part. This is one of the only places in the world, I think the only place in the world, that gets 3 rice harvests per year. This feeds all of Vietnam and much of Southeast Asia, super important to their economy. But there are dams being built in Laos, Thailand, which will reduce the flow down there. Vietnam, none too pleased about this. So this has the potential for a lot of conflict. In general, look at our water demand in the past 100 years. From 1900, the global freshwater use went from 9 billion meters cubed up to over 4 trillion meters cubed. This is a massive 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-fold increase thereabouts. So we are putting more stress on water as our population grows and as LEDCs become more economically developed and their water print increases. As our population grows, as our demand increases, not surprisingly, this is increasing the number of people who suffer from water scarcity. In just 25 years, from 2005 to 2030, we expect the number of people who live in water scarce regions to grow by 48%. This is a weird way to put it, 3,901 million. Another way to put it, nearly 4 billion human beings by 2030 will be in water scarce regions. That would represent nearly half of the world's population would suffer from water scarcity. That creates huge security issues and potential for conflict. Water management will be an enormous challenge in the coming century as our populations grow and as LEDCs gain in affluence and have more of a demand for water. Here is just some water conflicts. Conflicts can be political, or they can be actual armed conflicts, but you can see these water conflicts from 1930 up to 2018 really growing. In 2017, there were over 70 water conflicts, about 70 water conflicts because of a particularly dry year, especially like the monsoon didn't come, and so India and Bangladesh and China were much drier than normal, and this is where like nearly half the humans on Earth live. So there's lots of conflict about it, as there has been in the past. All right, that is the end of our lecture. Please take your notes, upload your notes, and be prepared for your quiz that will be on either Thursday or Friday.